This graph tries to show you a very simple three-level system. And then what you can see on the columns is we have manipulated the relative efficacy of each level of control. The best way, if you come across the Jim Reason stuff, is to think about each of the levels of control like a piece of Swiss cheese, and the relative effectiveness of that piece of cheese is proportional to the relative size of the holes to the cheese. So if you have a piece of Swiss cheese that's nearly all cheese and very little holes, that would have a high level of effectiveness, say 80 or 90%. On the other hand, if you have a very low effective control, that is a simple administrative control, it may be more whole than cheese. That is, it may be only 20 to 30% effective. What we've done in this demonstration is to manipulate the level of effectiveness of each of the controls, and we've tried to look at the overall effectiveness of each of the systems, having systematically varied the effectiveness of each of those controls. So if we take the column on the left, we have three controls, each of which are 80% effective. That means as the number of potential incidents reaches the first control, it will stop 80% of them. That is, 20% will go through to the next control, at which point 80% of those will be blocked, and then the remaining 20% of that will go through to level 3, where we will block another 80% of them. Let's imagine that there were 1,000 potential events at the top of that event trajectory. At level 1, about 80% of those will be knocked out. So from that original 1,000 potential events, 80% of them have been blocked, so we now only have 200. As they hit the level 2 control, 80% of those 200 remaining events will be eliminated, which takes us down to 40. Again, when it reaches level 3, 80% of those remaining 40 will be eliminated, leaving only 8 of the original 1,000 potential event trajectories. And you'll see there on the column at the bottom, it will show you that 99.2%, that is 8 out of 1,000 events remain, and 99.2% of all of the events have been prevented. Now, where the magic occurs is to look at what happens if I systematically vary the relative effectiveness of each of these levels. So each of the columns represents 3 levels at 80, 60, 40 and 20% effectiveness respectively. So on the right hand side, where we have 3 layers, each of which is 20% effective, we have effectively 3 very porous pieces of cheese, or 3 very simple administrative controls perhaps. And on the left-hand side, where we have 3 80%, they could be the classic engineering hierarchy of controls. Now, the important point to look at here is what is the relative effectiveness of a multi-layer system. If you see where we have 3 layers, each of which is 80% effective, those 3 systems eliminate 99.2% of all of the potential events. That is, the overall system effectiveness is greater than the effectiveness of any of the individual layers. Similarly, when we move to the right, if I take 3 layers, each of which is 60% effective, I still eliminate just under 95% of all of the potential events. And that's 3 layers who are only slightly more cheese than whole. If I move to the right-hand side, in the 3rd column, I have 3 controls, each of which is more whole than cheese. Each of those controls is 40% effective, but they still eliminate nearly 80% of all of the potential events. And if you look in the far right column, where we have 3 very wholly bits of cheese, 3 layers of defence, each of which is only 20% effective. That is, they are 80% air and 20% cheese. We still can block nearly 50% of all of the trajectories. The key point to take from this is that when you are looking at multi-layered control systems, even if the individual layers themselves are not particularly effective, as a system working together, they can be particularly effective. And in many cases, if you recall the slide we talked about previously, the cost of 2 or 3 low-cost controls, that is things around the 40 or 50% rate, can actually be much cheaper than trying to find a single control in the 90 to 100% range. The implications of this are profound from a fatigue management perspective. If you think about it, what is it that most organisations have traditionally used to manage fatigue-related risk? What is the single control that they have focused on? And as you will correctly identify, it's the roster. The problem in many organisations, we have moved to the far right of that curve. That is, for our roster to significantly reduce risk more, the cost, that is the marginal cost, the increase in cost to achieve that last 4 or 5% of risk in the system and eliminate it, is actually very expensive. On the other hand, you have the choice of A, further refining an individual control and moving to the very expensive side of the curve, or you can introduce additional controls. And as we'll often say to an organisation, I can give you a roster that will eliminate fatigue-related risk. You work on Tuesdays, you work between 10 and 11 in the morning, and we pay you $200,000 a year. That will effectively eliminate nearly all fatigue in the organisation. So what's the problem? Why don't we just do that for everybody? Well, the answer is really simple. The problem is that for organisations, the cost associated with continuing to refine the roster either reduces income or reduces operational effectiveness in a way that, for most people, there is a gut feeling that the cost of the increased safety isn't a good deal. That is, the loss of income or the loss of operational flexibility costs us more than the relative improvement in safety. I think in many organisations, the challenge is to get people to stop thinking about the roster and to work out what else you got. What other additional controls can we put in place that will enable the organisation to significantly reduce risk, but by introducing additional controls that can be relatively inexpensive. For example, if you look back to that curve we showed you before and you want to move from a cost effectiveness of 90% to 100%, that costs a lot. If you want to go halfway up that curve from 90 to 95%, it'll cost you about 1,000 units. On the other hand, if you introduced a second control that was 50% effective, that would only cost you a few hundred units. Once you understand this principle that as you try to refine a control, you reach a point of diminishing returns, and that's the point at which you need to introduce additional controls, you will understand how fatigue management at a multi-level system works, and most importantly, why you don't necessarily need to have perfect controls, you just need to have more controls.